A young woman's car breaks down on a dark highway late at night. She's relieved when she sees flashing lights pull up behind her. A police officer approaches, shows a badge, and offers to help. She trusts him completely because everything looks official: the uniform, the badge, the demeanor of authority. She gets into his vehicle thinking she's being rescued, but she's actually just become the latest victim of a predator who has perfected the art of using our trust in law enforcement against us. The most terrifying predators aren't always the ones lurking in shadows. Sometimes they're the ones we're taught from childhood to trust unconditionally. Gerard John Schaefer wasn't just pretending to be a cop, he actually was one, a Florida sheriff's deputy who used his badge and authority to abduct, torture, and murder young women throughout the early 1970s. His case reveals a disturbing truth about how positions of power can shield monsters and how our instinct to trust authority can be weaponized by those who understand human psychology. Welcome back to Crime Scout, True Stories. Today we're examining one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history, a law enforcement officer who became a serial killer, and the investigation that almost didn't happen because people couldn't believe a cop could be a monster. Gerard John Schaefer was born in 1946 in Wisconsin but grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, before his family moved to Florida. By all accounts, he had a troubled childhood marked by an obsessive, controlling mother and feelings of inadequacy. He was fascinated by law enforcement from a young age, but his interest had a dark edge. While other kids played normal games, Schaefer was reportedly obsessed with bondage, sadism, and violent fantasies involving women. As he grew older, these fantasies intensified. Schaefer desperately wanted to be a priest, then a doctor, then a teacher, but he failed at each ambition. What he really wanted was power over others, particularly women. When those career paths didn't work out, he found another route to authority. He became a police officer. In 1972, at age 26, Schaefer was hired as a deputy sheriff in Martin County, Florida. He finally had the uniform, the badge, and the power he'd always craved. And he immediately began using it to hunt. Schaefer's method was chillingly simple. He would patrol areas where young women were likely to be alone or vulnerable: beaches, highways, bus stops. He'd approach them in his uniform, with his patrol car and official badge, and he'd create a pretext for interaction. Sometimes he'd claim they were violating some ordinance, loitering or hitchhiking illegally. Other times he'd offer help, a ride, assistance with a broken-down car. Because he was a uniformed police officer, his victims trusted him completely. Why wouldn't they? We're conditioned from childhood to trust police, to see them as protectors. Once he had a victim alone, usually by taking them to a remote location under the guise of official police business, Schaefer would reveal his true nature. He would bind, torture, and eventually murder his victims. He often took them to secluded areas in the swamps and forests of South Florida, places where screams wouldn't be heard and bodies might never be found. The details of his crimes, which emerged later through his own writings and evidence collected, are among the most disturbing in criminal history. He treated murder like a hobby, documenting his crimes with photographs, keeping trophies, and writing detailed fantasies about his actions. What makes Schaefer's case particularly chilling is how close he came to getting away with it indefinitely. He was a police officer, someone above suspicion. When young women went missing in areas he patrolled, nobody initially looked at the deputy sheriff. He had the perfect cover, the perfect excuse to be anywhere, talking to anyone, at any time. His uniform made him invisible as a suspect. But Schaefer made a critical mistake. On July 21, 1972, just months into his job as a deputy, he approached two teenage girls, Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells, who were hitchhiking near Fort Lauderdale. He told them hitchhiking was illegal and that he needed to take them to the station. Instead, he drove them to a remote wooded area. He tied them to trees and told them he was going to kill them. But before he could complete his plan, he got a call on his police radio. There was an emergency that required his response. Schaefer made a calculated decision. He left the girls tied to the trees and responded to the call, apparently planning to return and finish what he'd started. The girls, showing incredible presence of mind and courage, managed to free themselves. They went straight to the police and reported what had happened. They described the deputy, his patrol car, and the location. The Martin County Sheriff's Department had no choice but to investigate one of their own. Schaefer was arrested and charged with assault and kidnapping. He was immediately fired from the Sheriff's Department. But here's where the system failed. Schaefer posted bail and was released pending trial. While out on bail, Schaefer didn't stop. He couldn't stop. On September 27, 1972, two young women, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, both 17, went missing. They'd last been seen accepting a ride from someone. Their disappearance didn't immediately connect to Schaefer because he was no longer a police officer, but he was still using the tactics he'd perfected, gaining trust through charm and manipulation, then revealing his true nature when victims were isolated. The investigation into Place and Jessup's disappearance eventually led back to Schaefer. When detectives searched his mother's home, where he'd been living since his arrest, they found a horrifying collection. There were photographs of young women bound and tortured. There were personal items belonging to numerous missing women, jewelry, identification cards, clothing. There were detailed written fantasies describing murders in graphic detail. And most damning, there were items belonging to Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The bodies of Place and Jessup were found in April 1973 in a wooded area in Martin County, badly decomposed but showing evidence of binding and torture consistent with Schaefer's documented methods. He was arrested and charged with their murders. The evidence was overwhelming. In October 1973, Gerard Schaefer was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. But 2 confirmed murders were just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper into Schaefer's history and the evidence found in his possession, they began to suspect he was responsible for many more deaths. Items belonging to numerous missing women were found in his possession. His writings described murders that matched unsolved cases across Florida and beyond. Investigators ultimately suspected Schaefer in the deaths of more than 30 women and girls, though he was never tried for these additional crimes. Schaefer himself alternately denied and bragged about his crimes. In prison, he wrote extensively, producing stories and supposed fiction that many believe were actually thinly veiled confessions to additional murders. He communicated with true crime writers, sometimes hinting at crimes, other times denying everything. He claimed to be a victim of circumstance, wrongly convicted, but his own writings and the physical evidence told a different story. One of the most disturbing aspects of Schaefer's case is how his position as a law enforcement officer facilitated his crimes and delayed his capture. How many victims might have been saved if he'd been stopped sooner? How many women trusted him because of his uniform and paid with their lives? The case raised serious questions about psychological screening for police officers and oversight of law enforcement behavior. Schaefer's story didn't end with a confession or redemption. On December 3, 1995, he was found stabbed to death in his cell at Florida State Prison. His cellmate, Vincent Rivera, who was serving time for murder, was charged with killing Schaefer. The motive was never entirely clear. Some reports suggested it was over a dispute about a cup of coffee or watching television. Gerard Schaefer died violently, much like his victims, though his death was far quicker and less torturous than what he'd inflicted on others. The Gerard Schaefer case represents a nightmare scenario, the protector becoming the predator. It highlights the vulnerability we all face when we're conditioned to trust authority figures without question. His badge gave him access, credibility, and the benefit of the doubt that allowed him to operate far longer than he should have. The 2 girls who escaped, Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells, are the heroes of this story. Their courage to come forward and accuse a police officer, knowing they might not be believed, ultimately stopped Schaefer's killing spree, even if it came too late for Susan Place and Georgia Jessup and likely many others. This case changed how law enforcement agencies screen applicants and monitor officer behavior. It reinforced the importance of believing victims even when they're accusing people in positions of authority. And it serves as a grim reminder that uniforms and badges don't make someone trustworthy, character does, and that should be verified before power is granted. This has been Crime Scout, True Stories. Gerard Schaefer used our trust in law enforcement as a weapon, proving that the most dangerous predators are sometimes the ones wearing badges. His crimes remind us that authority must always be accountable and that victim testimony should be taken seriously regardless of who the accused might be. Subscribe for more cases that expose the darkness hiding behind respectability and the investigations that finally brought truth to light.